Yes, Patiki, please.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you all. Good afternoon. Welcome to the ICRS's regular Wednesday forum. And today we will have a speaker who will be talking about women in the Middle East, a case study of women's rights in Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel. So the speaker is Dr. Saba Sumekh. She is originally from Iran, who later on moved at the age of 10 to the US and is living in Los Angeles. She is the Associate Director of the American Jewish Committee in the Los Angeles office, and also a lecturer at the Academy for Jewish Religion in California. There, she teaches religious studies, women and religion, and Middle Eastern history courses. Professor Sumekh is the editor of the book Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews in America and the author of the book From the Shahs to Los Angeles, 3 Generations of Iranian Jewish Women Between Religion and Culture. Her book was awarded the gold medal in the 2013 Independent Publisher Book Award in the religion category. And I'm sure she will provide a lot of insights and new knowledge for most of us who are studying and teaching in CRCS and ICRS. For your information, Dr. Sumekh, we have a number of Middle Eastern studies program here in Yogyakarta, in Gajah Mada University, in the Islamic University of Sunan Kalijogo, and also in Ahmad Dahlan University, and I would presume also in the Muhammadiyah University. I'm also teaching at the Middle Eastern Studies, Postgraduate Studies program at the Islamic University, teaching the theories of IR in the context of Middle Eastern studies. Wonderful. So I'm sure that many of our students would also be quite excited on hearing your presentation. Now, having said that, you know, I'm involved in this V20 group, which is a group of scholars and activists on values. And we are engaging the G20 countries. And as you know, the G20 is being held in Saudi Arabia. Yes. And it was funny, just yesterday or 2 days ago, one of the members of our group in our mailing list brought up the issue of Laujan, who is this PhD candidate from Sorbonne who went missing a couple of years ago in Saudi Arabia for her activism. You know, she was against the idea of women not being able to drive in Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. So I think your presentation today would hopefully give us and enlighten us on some of the trends and developments with respect to gender roles and the women's role in these 3 countries in the Middle East. So I will perhaps give you like 45 minutes maximum for your presentation, and then it will be followed by some questions and answers. So we are also being relayed in YouTube, so I'm not quite sure how we can engage them, but we'll make sure that some of the questions and issues being raised in YouTube will also be able to be relayed to our discussion in Zoom here. So, بفرمایید خانم.
Merci. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure and it's such an honor to be here. Indonesia is one of my favorite countries. I wish I was there right now, but I am there in spirit. So we have a lot to cover, covering 3 countries. So let's just get right to it and we could discover more and dive into it more as we answer the questions and answers. So Aziz, you will be my co-pilot. Can we start? Thank you. So we're looking at women in the Middle East. Aziz, go ahead, please. And the regions we'll be focusing on, of course, are Iran. We are going to be focusing on Saudi Arabia, and we're going to be focusing on Israel. I specifically wanted to look at a Shia country, a Wahhabi Sunni country, and then a Jewish country to just look at what has progressed and transgressed in these 3 countries. Let's move on. Thank you. Okay, so let's look at women in Saudi Arabia. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. So I won't get into the politics of Saudi Arabia in regards to the government. As I'm sure most of you know, Saudi Arabia is a monarchy ruled by King Abdullah since 2005. The current king is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who I will just refer to now as MBS going on in the lecture. And Saudi Arabia is dealing with a lot of challenges. Its economy, other oil exporting countries such as Qatar, and then terrorism that it has within its own country and outside of the country. Let's move on, please. Two events that really affected the kingdom, which is what Saudi Arabia is called, what happened in 1979. Number one, you had the Grand Mosque seizure, and the second was the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Next slide. So the Islamic Revolution in Iran, when Khomeini came into power, the Saudi kingdom feared Shia dominance, meddling in the Middle East, and that the Shia minorities in Saudi Arabia in the Gulf would start rebelling and basically be influenced by Khomeini's revolution. And then also in that year, you had the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by Islamic extremists. These are militants who believe that the Saudi government was corrupt and un-Islamic. They didn't approve of Saudi Arabia's close relationship with the United States. And as a result of these two instances, basically world instances that affected Saudi Arabia, one within the country, one outside of the country, Saudi Arabia began to look inward and became a lot more conservative with the way it practiced its Wahhabi Sunni Islam. Let's move on to the next slide. So, as most of you are familiar, Wahhabi culture, there's no alcohol, secular music, film, socializing between the sexes. No other religion is allowed to be practiced. Women must cover their bodies and their faces with the abaya and the niqab, a veil that covers the face. Let's move on. So let's look at women in the kingdom. The first school opened up for women and it was established in 1955. By 1970, women were able to enter the universities. And we see little progress, incremental progress is being made in the 20th century, and they were basically minimal. Women definitely had access to education, but they were deprived of most social, political, and legal rights. Let's move on. In 2015, King Abdullah granted women the right to vote. He also appointed 30 women to the top advisory board, the Shura Council. He increased women's political and economic rights, and he also allowed them to have access to higher education. They were issued ID cards for the first time in 2001. And in 2009, we had the first female minister, vice minister. Now, these are important progresses because I think a lot of times the media does not discuss what's going on. And there is just this understanding of women in the Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia and Iran, as being agents of misogyny and not really having any rights and not even fighting for their own rights. Let's move on. Now, let's look at MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and his Vision 23. He really came into Saudi Arabia with this idea that he wants to change Saudi Arabia in certain ways. And he specifically did this focusing on women. Now, human rights activists will say he is using this as a way of getting people to not focus on other things, such as what's happening in Yemen, what happened with Khashoggi. But let's look at some of the changes that he made and some of the changes that did not happen. He said women can get an education and seek medical care without male consent, which is a really big deal because women were not able to even go see doctors unless their husbands, their brothers, or their fathers gave them the okay. Human rights groups say that this is really on an ad hoc basis. Women always face discrimination in courts, in divorce and inheritance. MBS said women do not need to bring a male guardian to identify them anymore, and that their testimony considered half of a man in some cases is no longer legitimate. 60% of the university students are women, but what we see is that there's a very high dropout rate, especially as women get married at a younger age. The average age of marriage is 25. So as soon as women get married, they tend to not, in Saudi Arabia, take a job. But this, of course, depends on their finances. And the literacy rate is very impressive. It's 90% for young women in Saudi Arabia. Let's move on. Now, women were not allowed to go to theaters. Theaters didn't even exist in Saudi Arabia after 1979. Movie theaters have reopened and now women can attend. We've talked about women driving, and that was a huge issue because women were not allowed to drive. Women would, if you could afford it, you would have someone drive for you. And a lot of times women could not afford it. And they would have their 9, 10, 11-year-old boys driving them, which also made Saudi Arabia have the highest rate of car accidents. But women can now drive in Saudi Arabia. They can attend sporting events under MBS. And he also relaxed the kingdom's mandatory conservative dress code for tourists, not for women who are Saudi, but for tourists. And what we're seeing now in Saudi Arabia is that you no longer see the morality police trolling neighborhoods and shopping malls, making sure that men and women aren't talking to each other, are not inappropriately behaving, etc. So in some ways, MBS has really made those social rules more lax. Let's move on. One of the things that he did was he hosted an electronic music festival in December 2019 with 60,000 people in attendance. And this was a huge deal for Saudi Arabia. There was no separation of gender during that time. The Saudi government paid lots of money for models, DJs, and social influencers to be flown in. And a lot of people said that this was his way of trying to dilute attention and take attention away from his human rights abuses abroad. The problem with this EDM music festival was that all of a sudden you had this type of freedom and people were not behaving appropriately. And lots of women were reporting sexual assault cases that were taking place where they couldn't even dance without men groping them. Even women who were wearing the abaya, who were wearing the hijab, were being groped. And the Riyadh police arrested 200 for harassment and immorality during that time. Let's move on. Now, as we've talked about, Saudi Arabia was known for its gender segregation. And before MBS, women were separated from men in public. And the strict segregation policies made it really, really difficult for employers to hire women. So basically, a lot of working women had literally no access to senior positions or policy-making positions. And businesses and government agencies in Saudi Arabia were segregated, except, of course, for Aramco and some other foreign companies, especially in the oil industry. Let's move on. So in 2019, MBS announced the Women in the Workplace initiative, where he said women are required to get equal pay for equal work. Women make up 20% of Saudi Arabia's domestic labor force, but they earn only 54% of what men make. So this was a major improvement. It also said that it does not demand complete gender segregation in the workplace, but instead it requires that employers have female employees provide a cubicle for any woman that requests one, and that female employees have options to work in a mixed gender office or in a private cubicle. So it's up to the woman to decide what she wants to do. Let's move on, please. The employer is obligated to also make sure at least 2 female employees are working in any mixed gender area, so a woman does not feel alone in a male co-worker space. And the government is promoting women-only industrial parks and workspaces to appeal to conservative women, to make sure that they feel comfortable being out in the public space and they could also work in segregated environments. And furthermore, there's a series of bureaucratic and government reforms which are being taking place right now to try to legally and economically make it increasingly more easy for women to work in government services. Let's move on. Now, the male guardianship system is something that is still an issue in Saudi Arabia. It has always been an issue. What we had was that the guardianship system said that male relatives control basically the lives of women. When women could travel, the education they could receive, the medical treatment they could receive, who, when, where they get married. There's even an app called Apshare, which allows Saudi men to track women so they can know if they're traveling. They get message alerts, which tells the men if a woman's using her passport or driving across the border. This makes it really difficult for women to flee abusive homes, and fleeing an abusive home is considered a crime in Saudi Arabia. If they are caught, women are jailed or they are housed in government-run shelters. until her guardian comes and permits her release. And a lot of times the guardians are the ones who are physically abusing her. Let's move on. Now, what happened was a lot of women sought refuge abroad. And they were using social media to gain their support, and they were actually tracking on TikTok and other social media outlets as they were fleeing to Turkey, or if they were fleeing to Thailand, etc. And because many of these women, again, were fighting to push an end to Saudi Arabia's guardianship system. And the big criticism of human rights organizations towards MBS was that they said, although he tries to present himself as a leader who is steering the country towards a more secular modernity, women feel trapped and are running away in hopes of gaining asylum in Western countries. Let's move on. So what has the Saudi response been in the past? I mean, in the past, we're looking at 2018, 2017, 2019, very recently, was that they ramped up a campaign to stem the flow of women running away. And they even had an online video comparing women who flee the country to people who are joining terrorist groups. And they are saying it's a vast international conspiracy that's aiming to damage the kingdom's reputation by, in a sense, corrupting these young women. Let's move on. Now, in August 2019, MBS changed the guardianship laws where he said women are allowed to apply for a passport and travel without the permission of a male guardian. This is huge. Prior to this, as we've talked about, women were basically seen as minors and they had to get permission from husbands, fathers, the men in their lives to travel. He also said that women are granted the right to apply for birth certificates for their children and death certificates. And normally that was just available for the men. Let's move on. And this new guardianship law extends to women in the workplace and in the home. And they also receive standard employment discrimination protection. They also have the right to register the birth of their children, live apart from their husbands, and obtain family records. She could also now, along with her husband, register as a co-head of the household. And Saudi Arabia in 2019, also, the government has rolled out laws penalizing domestic abuse, including neglect. So these are huge, huge laws that are really affecting women and really changing the way women have rights in Saudi Arabia. Let's move on. However, the criticism of MBS is that this change is slow, that even though it's implemented, customs and culture, men are not and fathers are not actually upholding them. The guardianship rules will still continue to govern many other aspects of a woman's life, including marriage and exiting prison. And a woman must still seek a male guardian's permission to enter a domestic violence shelter, which of course does not help her in any way. Let's move on. And a lot of the women who were imprisoned, who chose to run away, who spoke out against MBS and the rules that they believed were misogynistic, a lot of those women are still held in prison, even though MBS made a lot of the changes. So Ratna Megam, a senior women's rights researcher at Human Rights Watch, said, Saudi Arabia's long overdue legal reforms should provide Saudi women a much greater degree of control over their lives, but this is a very bittersweet victory, as courageous Saudi women who push for these changes remain behind bars or face unfair trials. And of course, even now that women have more rights, now that they have more opportunities to be out in the public space on their own, the Apshare app is still used and is still very popular. So while from the government perspective, these rules are quote unquote being enforced, what we're seeing is that they're not really being enforced on the micro level on the ground. Let's move on. Now let's look at women in Iran. And I recognize we're really going through this fast. And, you know, if you're interested, if there's time, we could, again, expound on these, or I could always come back. Okay, women in Iran. Let's move on. So if you look at Iran, Iran's really in an interesting area. It's the Middle East and it's also Central Asia. And you're going to see that this influence really affects the rules and regulations that have taken place in Iran. Let's move on. Okay, let's look at the Pahlavi dynasty. This is the dynasty that was ruling Iran, or what was first Persia and then later on became Iran, from 1925 to 1979. The Pahlavi dynasty has been described as being modern, secular, and chose to emancipate the Persian Empire from its Shia and Sunni background. This is a picture of my own family in the 1950s in Iran. And if you look the way they're dressed, this is my father's side. My father, his 8 siblings, my grandmother and grandfather. This could look like it's Paris. This could look like it is Germany. And we're going to see that Reza Pahlavi, the first king of Iran, basically forced Iranians to dress in European clothing. And the religious minorities, my family's Jewish, the religious minorities loved that. But we're going to see the pendulum swung very far to the right after. Let's move on. So this is Reza Pahlavi, who took control of Iran. At that time, it was called Persia, from the Qajar dynasty in 1925. Let's go on. And then his son, Mohammed Reza Pahlavi, took control in 1941 for reasons that we don't have time to get into. We could talk about the politics. Most of you probably already know it. Let's move on. Okay, women's rights under the first Shah, Reza Shah Pahlavi. He was heavily influenced by Ataturk in Turkey and really wanted to secularize and modernize Iran. And he really looked to women's rights as a way of appropriating those modernizations. In 1928, he provided financial support to study abroad. In 1935, women were admitted to Tehran University. In 1936, mandatory unveiling of women and desegregation of women, meaning that if you wore a veil, you were actually imprisoned. The veil in Farsi is called the chador. So he forced Iranians, or at that time they were called Persians, 1936 is when he changed the name to Iran. He forced Iranians to appropriate westernized clothing. And he really wanted to make sure that people were no longer wearing chadors and that they were no longer looking like they were Shia Iranians. Let's move on. Okay, also rights under Mohammed Reza Shah, his son. 1944, education became compulsory. Women had to go to school, although a lot of religious men were not sending their daughters to school because, number one, they were not able to wear the chador. And number two, they were mixed gender schools. So a lot of the religious women were not going to school, even though by law they had to. By the 1950s, birth of numerous women's rights organizations. 1963, women's suffrage, and 6 women were elected to the parliament. By 69, you had women who were judges, including the famous Shirin Ebadi, who went on later on to win a Nobel Peace Prize. And women were elected to town, city, and county councils. Now, what's important to note is that with all of these rights that the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, gave to women, more women came out to support Ayatollah Khomeini than they did Mohammad Reza Shah and his wife, Farah. Let's move on. In 1975, you have the Family Protection Law, which granted equal rights in marriage and divorce. It enhanced a woman's rights in child custody. It increased the minimum age of marriage to 18 for women and 20 for men. My great-grandmother was married in Iran at 12 years old. No, my great-grandmother was married at 9. My grandmothers were married at 12 and 16. The Shah made that illegal. He eliminated polygamy. Abortion was made legal, as was family planning. It was illegal to discriminate based on sex. He wanted equal pay for equal work, and women were encouraged to run for political office. Let's move on. By 1978, 40% of the girls aged 6 and above were literate in Iran. Over 12,000 literacy corps women were teaching in villages. The Shah really focused on villages and trying to get young men and women to enter schools, etc. 33% of university students were women. More women than men took the entrance exam at law schools and medicine, and 333 women were elected to local councils. 22 women were elected to parliament. So as we see, women had lots of rights as mayors, ambassadors, governors, etc. Let's move on. The Islamic Revolution of 1979. As I said, more women came to support Khomeini than they did the Shah and his wife Farah. And these were not only religious women, but a lot of secular women also supported Khomeini. Khomeini was brilliant. He presented himself more as a Che Guevara figure than he did as a Shia theocrat. And people really believe that he will change Iran, which he did, but they didn't really think that he was going to change it to a theocracy. And women actually secular women who put on the chador just as a way of showing support for Khomeini, thinking, okay, now we could take it off once he came into power, but they quickly very soon realized that they weren't able to take it off. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 transformed Iran from a monarchy to the Islamic Republic. Khomeini became the supreme leader, and it became a theocratic constitution based on Shia Islamic law. So as an Islamic economy, cultural practices, industry was nationalized, laws and schools were Islamicized, and Western influence was banned, especially from 1980 to 1988 during the Iran-Iraq War. Let's move on. So let's look at some of these images here. Here you see pictures of secular women on top with religious women, all of them supporting Khomeini. And this was the first time you really saw the secular and the religious coming together. You had communists, socialists, secularists, religious, men and women who were sent abroad by the Shah to study in Europe and America who supported Khomeini. And you see these images of Khomeini was literally seen almost like the 13th cleric, the 13th Imam within Shia Islam. He was revered highly by all people, most people in Iran who supported him. It was not just a religious revolution, but just really also a secular and intellectual revolution. Let's move on. These are images and pictures of Iran during the time that I was born in 1976, during the time that my parents were living there. These are pictures of women studying at Tehran University. I don't know what this image is of a man and a woman groping each other in a telephone booth with someone watching. Let's move on. And these are images, European images, well, these are Persian, Iranian ads in the 1970s, obviously before 1979. For European hair color and for European cologne. Let's move on. And then with the Islamic Revolution of 1979, this is the way women had to dress. And what Khomeini did was give women who were religious the rights to basically become the morality police and walk around. They got the arms that the Iranian army basically dropped under the Shah and escaped and left and ran away. And they were holding these weapons and walking around the streets of Tehran, Hamadan, Shiraz, etc., making sure that people were acting appropriately. Let's move on. It was at that time where even if a piece of hair showed, or if they were wearing any makeup, that women were imprisoned, or, I mean, if they were lucky, they were scolded. If not, they dealt with lashings, imprisonment, etc. Now let's look at post-79 revolution. Women in Iran are highly educated and literate, one of the highest literacy rates in the world. Now what happened was, remember how I said under the Shah, a lot of religious men, fathers were not letting their daughters go to school, even though it was mandatory. When Khomeini came into power and women had to wear the chador and the schools were separated by gender, ironically, more women were going to school because of the religious aspect to these schools. So more women were becoming educated and literate. Today, more than 60% of all university students in Iran are women. And this mostly occurred after the death of Khomeini in 1989. But there's still rules that we see in Iran, very similar to Saudi Arabia in some sense, the women, or the past Saudi Arabia, where women cannot leave the country without her husband's permission. A woman's testimony as a witness is worth half that of a man. They banned contraception and family planning. However, now there's 80+ million people in Iran. So that changed after Khomeini's death. Now family planning has been implemented, and 70% of the population of Iran is under the age of 30. Let's move on. Women in Tehran, in Iran today, they are excluded from numerous fields and occupations. And these were the effects of the Iran-Iraq War on women's occupations. In 1992, women were allowed in certain professions that were considered Islamically appropriate, such as pharmacists, midwives, laboratory workers. They could be legal consultants, but not judges. So here you have someone like Shirin Ebadi, who is this famous judge, so brilliant. And then once Khomeini and the Islamic Republic came into power, she had to be demoted as a legal consultant and no longer could be a judge. 35% of the public sector employees are women, and most work in the field of education and health. Let's move on. So clothing-wise, women must wear the chador and loose-fitting clothes. Modesty requirements are still in force. However, they are now a little bit more lax. Makeup was banned until the 1990s, but that's not the case anymore. Polygamy and temporary marriage is still permitted in Iran. Up to 4 wives are allowed, subject to certain restrictions, but of course that's only for men and not for women. Let's move on. Honor killings is an issue in Iran, where if the father kills his daughter, he's not liable for the death penalty, but imprisonment. As we've talked about, women can't be judges, they can't attend sporting events. The legal age of marriage for girls has been reduced to 9, and then later on it was raised to 13. But what we're seeing is, as more Iranian girls are being educated in the 1980s and 90s, 2000, the government has opened up higher religious education for women. And we're seeing a whole movement of Islamic feminism, where women are fighting for their rights within Islamic law and jurisprudence. So some women are working within the system as entrepreneurs within parliament, and other women are working outside of the system. Let's move on. According to Amnesty International, women in Iran face discrimination in law and practice in relation to marriage and divorce, inheritance, child custody, nationality, and international law. Let's move on. So, in 2006, led by women like Shirin Ebadi and Mehran Gizkar, again, unbelievable lawyers and judges who got demoted. You have the 1 million signatures for the repealing of discriminatory laws. And I just have a personal story to tell you about Mehran Gizkar. She's a woman with a turquoise scarf. She came to UCLA to speak when I was a professor at UCLA, and I had the honor of moderating a panel with her. Mehran Gizkar is a very well-known lawyer in Iran, spoke on behalf of women's rights, and the regime came to her and basically said, if you continue to do this, we're going to imprison you. And they did. And she had breast cancer. The Europeans convinced the regime to let her out to get treatment in Europe. And at that point, they arrested her husband, where he committed suicide in jail. So she escaped Iran and came to America, was giving a lecture at UCLA. I had the honor of moderating that lecture. I put it up on my social media. I didn't do hashtags or anything like that. This is right when social media and Instagram started. And I looked at my social media after giving an 1.5-hour lecture. I finally just looked and I saw all these text messages. And when I looked at what was written, there were numerous death threats against her and threats against me from men abroad for just the fact that we were hosting her at UCLA and, I was moderating this panel. So this is what these women have to deal with. Even when Shirin Ebadi received the Nobel Prize, they still deal with a lot of misogyny and threats from abroad. Let's move on. So the role of women in Iran's Green Revolution. Just really quickly, the Green Revolution happened in 2009, where it was a political revolution where people believed that Mossavi should have been the president and not Ahmadinejad, and that their vote didn't count. As women were integral in bringing Khomeini into power, women were also integral in the Green Nonviolent Revolution to try to bring Mossavi into power. So women played a huge role in this revolution. It was peaceful, it was nonviolent, although they were harassed, they were beaten, they were killed by the Iranian military and Basij, and many women were sexually assaulted and raped once they were imprisoned. Let's move on. Neda Agha Sultan, we're all Neda. I don't know if people are familiar with the story of Neda. Neda was she was just peacefully protesting with her father when someone from the Basij, a revolutionary guard, shot her and she died in the streets of Iran. And it became a really important call for women where they said, we're all Neda. Again, talking about women's rights, human rights, voting rights, etc. Let's move on. And the girls of Antelope Street. Antelope Street is a famous street in Iran, and there was a series of protests by Iranian women against mandatory wearing of the chador. And this protest was inspired by this picture of this woman here, Vida Movahed. And so that's still a protest taking place today of women taking off their chadors in Iran. Obviously a symbolism of more than just wearing the headscarf and more about women's rights in the country. Let's move on. Okay, now let's quickly talk about women in Israel. Let's go to the next slide, please. So women in Israel. Israel is a democracy based on a parliamentary system. The state of Israel will ensure, according to their Declaration of Independence, complete equality for social and political rights to all of its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. So Israeli law prohibits discrimination based on gender and employment wages and provides for class action suits if that happens. But what we still see is that there's still wage disparities between men and women in in Israel, and large participation of women in the workplace in executive positions. In 2017, Israel was ranked the world's 8th safest country for women. And just recently, it just came out yesterday that Israel was named the best country in the world for female entrepreneurs, according to MasterCard Index of Women Entrepreneurs in 2020. So let's move on. So we're going to see in some ways Israeli women have lots of rights. In other ways, especially when it comes to the domestic sphere, they don't. Israel was the 3rd country in the world to be led by a female prime minister, Golda Meir. The fact that she was able to obtain high positions within the Israeli government is shown an example of the opportunities women have. However, Meir was the only female prime minister, and only a few women have been able to rise to government positions. In 2019, women comprise about 25% of Israel's 120-member Knesset. The Knesset is the parliament. That is good, except, well, in comparison to America, it's about the same number, 25% in America. The Scandinavian countries, you have 40%, and in Israel's neighbors in the Sunni Middle East, it's about 18%. Let's move on. Now, the Committee on the Status of Women, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, passed an order to prevent discrimination, to combat violence against women, and promote equality in politics, life cycle events, and education. Rape, including spousal rape, is a crime in Israel. You have women's shelters and abuse reporting hotlines that are being operated. The police operate a call center to inform victims about their cases, and women organizations provide counseling, crisis intervention, legal assistance, and shelter for women who have been raped. Let's move on. Let's look at the case of Moshe Katsav. Moshe Katsav was the president of Israel from 2000 to 2007. In 2010, Katsav was convicted of 2 counts of rape, obstruction of justice, and other charges. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. He tried to appeal that with the Israeli Supreme Court, who had women on the Supreme Court as judges, and they affirmed Katsav's conviction and punishment. Which just shows you how seriously they do take rape, that a president of Israel was convicted of rape and then sentenced by women on the Supreme Court for rape. After Moshe Katsav's case, it really brought this concept, well, the idea of rape, and not the idea of rape, it really made rape an issue, and women felt more comfortable to come out, and call centers received record numbers of calls following the verdict. Let's move on. The Supreme Court, for example, has 15 judges. 4 today are women. The current president of the Supreme Court is a woman named Esther Hayut, who, again, is a Chief Justice. She's a Supreme Court president. We even have someone like Abdel Rahman Zoubi, who took his seat in 1999 as the first Arab to sit on the Supreme Court. I wish we had time to get into this aspect of it, but I just wanted to make sure that we included that. Let's move on. Now, the secular versus the religious. Israel is a democracy, but it is constantly struggling with its religious background. The founding fathers of the state of Israel were mostly secular, well, saw Israel as a secular, liberal, socialist ideology. They assigned the religious institutions to deal with all matters regarding rape, marriage, conversion, divorce, burial, etc. And so thus Orthodox Jews were the ones who were responsible for Jewish law. They obtained a monopoly on Jewish religious life and personal status. And this is where we're seeing how women are not treated fairly in Israel. Let's move on. So basically the state of Israel continued the millet system, which it got from the Ottoman Empire. So depending on your religion, you are going to that court for when it comes to personal matters of marriage, divorce, etc. So 1953 for Jews, the rabbinical courts were established, where the chief rabbinate was in charge of marriage, divorce for all Jews in Israel. Let's move on. In 1951, women's equal rights law was passed, which said that women have to have equality before the law. But we're going to see when it comes to divorce and marriage, that's not the way it works. Let's move on. In 1992, the Knesset passed the Basic Law of Human Dignity and Liberty, the right for equality and prohibition of group discrimination, including on grounds of sex. Supreme Court have ruled that equality for women is incorporated in the rights of women for the legal system. Let's move on. But this is where we really see that it's not protecting women. Divorce laws are decided by, as we mentioned, the religious courts. So any woman who wants to get a divorce, she has to basically stay married forever unless her husband releases her of marriage. The state will not declare Jewish marriage over until the husband physically delivers what is called a get, a religious bill of divorce, to his wife. And this is based on Jewish law. Let's move on. Now, this is in direct violation of women's rights. And since 2000, due to the efforts of non-government organizations like the Center for Women's Justice, family courts all over Israel have awarded substantial damages to women if their husbands have not allowed them to have a get, a religious divorce. These family courts have also declared it abusive to withhold a divorce from a woman. They have also said that you could sue third parties like the parents of the husband who will not grant the divorce in order to force the husband to give the divorce. Let's move on. Marriage also performed under the auspices of the religious courts. In Israel, there's no interfaith marriages are performed legally. You could get married outside of the country and they recognize it. And so thus a lot of interfaith couples get married outside of Israel. Some will go again to Greece. They will go to other parts of, other parts of the world in order to get married and come back. So civil, interfaith, and same-sex marriages entered into abroad are recognized by the state of Israel. Let's move on. Let's look at women in the military. Israel's one of the only few countries in the world with a mandatory military service for women, and 2 years, women are required 2 years in military service. If you're a religious woman, then you don't actually go into the military, but you go into what's called the national service. And women have been a part of Israel's military since before the founding of the country in 1948. In 2000, the military service law states that the right of women have the right to basically serve in any role in the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. And so they have the same rights equal to the rights of men. Let's move on. As of 2011, 88% of all roles in the Israeli Defense Force are open to female candidates, while women can be found in 69% of the positions. In 2014, the IDF said that fewer than 4% of women are in combat positions, such as infantry, tank crews, artillery, fighter pilots. Rather, they are concentrated in combat support. So let's move on. By 2000, a platoon was named Karakol, were formed for men and women to serve together in light infantry. 70% of that Karakol is basically women. Let's move on for the sake of time. So here we have images of women in combat. Again, very new, but they are allowed to now be a part of the combat world. Let's move on. And I wanted to end with LGBTQ rights, rights for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer rights, because a lot of times if you look at LGBTQ rights, it will also let you know the rights that women have in a country. And Israel's LGBTQ rights are the most developed and tolerant in the Middle East. Israel recognizes same-sex couples and marriages that were performed abroad, as we've talked about. Discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation is prohibited. Same-sex couples are allowed to jointly adopt. LGBTQ people are also allowed to serve openly in the military. And discrimination and harassment of LGBTQ in recruitment, placement, and promotion in Israel is prohibited. And we will end now.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Vicky, you didn't think I could do it in 45 minutes. I did it in 47.
Wow, no, perfect. خیلی ممنون.
خواهش میکنم.
So thank you very much for your fascinating comparative study on the gender roles in the Middle East, namely in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, and also Israel. We can obviously see some discrepancies and some similarities in terms of the discriminatory laws and discrimination practices, but also some illuminating examples of really liberal policies toward LGBTIQ, the same-sex marriage, and also what I found interesting is the position of women in combat in the Israeli country. I never thought of that, but as far as my memory served me correctly, I mean, I had a classmate in Boston when I was studying for my master's, and I remember, I think she was a member of the special forces in the Israeli IDF, and
yes,
that sort of got me thinking about how different that is in many Muslim countries where women are not supposed to be in combat positions. So that's very interesting. So,
although we do know that there were women in combat positions during the time of the Prophet. So
sure, yes,
right,
indeed, that's correct. Okay, so I'd like to open up a discussion here. If anyone from the Zoom here, we have quite a number of people. I think at least we have like 50 people in Zoom.
Wonderful.
And I'm sure there are much more in YouTube. You know, we are known for our jamkaret, the time, the concept of time here is rather elastic. So, yeah.
I'm Persian, I know exactly what that means.
Right. So I would welcome any comments or questions from the floor. You can turn on your mic and start to pose any questions you might have to Professor Sumekh. Please. I think we have a number of people from different institutions here, from CRCS, from obviously ICRS, from UGM, from the Islamic University in Kadiri and elsewhere.
Hi, everyone.
Yes. Any questions?
I just did such a great job. No one has any more questions, huh?
Well, if not, then maybe I should begin by responding to some of the comments that you made. And I was wondering how you would sort of conceptualize gender roles and, the problem of discrimination in the Middle East, and whether you find this to be sort of wholly connected to the Islamic teachings or theology, or do you see this as a sort of deviance from the Islamic teachings and theology? I mean, as you correctly pointed out, that some of the female companions of the Prophet also were involved in combat during various battles and conflicts. So would you just talk about that? How religion
sure,
is in these practices?
Absolutely. And I would have to say my focus is not on Islamic jurisprudence or narrative. I've been very blessed to study and to, with Islamic feminists at my time at Harvard Divinity School, Santa Barbara, for my PhD and my undergraduate work at UC Berkeley. And from everything that I've studied, it's really not Islam more than it is the cultural practice that has relegated women into the private sphere, et cetera. So I think that's what's going on. And again, Dickie, I think you could say better than I can. And your Muslim practitioners could probably say better than I can. But from what I've studied, it's, the Prophet Muhammad was very liberal with women, and he spoke with them, he had them study with him. Aisha was out in the battlefield, etc. You also had Sufi poets like Rabia, etc. So these were the women that I've studied and looked at, and so I think it's more of a cultural aspect than it is a religious one. And we're seeing this taking place in Saudi Arabia today. And this is exactly what happened in Iran. Just because the government's saying you need to now change the rules are different, it doesn't mean that it's trickling down to the everyday practice, because for hundreds or thousands of, for 1,000 years or hundreds of years, for centuries, people are practicing in a certain way. And a lot of that has to do with tribal traditions. A lot of that has to do with just the cultural norms that have basically taken place around that region. And again, each country is different. So it just depends on which country you're looking at.
Sorry, I should
Dickie, I'm sorry. I think you're still on mute.
Yes. I was living in Tehran in 1992, and so this was right after the Khomeini era, and I could vividly remember going around Tehran, seeing the Comité or the morality police, putting women on trucks just because they showed hair or dyed their hair red or blonde and so on, or wearing
lipstick or etc.
Right,
yeah.
I mean, that was a common occurrence for me in Tehran, but it seems like the last visits I've made in Iran that some things have changed. People are much more relaxed nowadays, and the women are much more liberal and easy with their fashion. Do you see this as well?
Yes, you definitely. Yes, and again, as we've talked about, Dickie, you know Iran better than I do in terms of what's going on in the streets today, because I haven't had the opportunity to go back. But what you do see is that you could see the difference between the women who are religious, the Shia women, because of the black, chadors that they still choose to wear, very similar to the ones they wore under the time that Khomeini was in power, and the more liberal, secular women who loosely wear the chador, wear makeup, who really are expressing themselves through the way they're dressing, through their color of their hair, through their makeup, etc. And luckily, women aren't being, for the most part, for wearing makeup, et cetera, they're not dealing with this. Iran is known as having the rhinoplasty country in the world with nose jobs. Mm-hmm. So people are really expressing themselves through the way they look, through the way they dress. And they also have social media. They know what's going on, and they are able to travel to other parts of the world, all over Europe, all over the Gulf. And, they want to express themselves that way. And as I showed you pictures of what Iran looked like before the 79 revolution. And people would talk about, going to discos and, women are part of society. Now, misogyny still always existed, but especially if you lived in Tehran, in the capital, you didn't really feel like you felt it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was in Qom a few years back, and we had some professors, including female professors from the U.S. at the time, Professor Heidi Hatzel, who was then president of the Hartford Seminary, and she was shocked to find that the Qom actually revolves around a female saint, right? With the Matsuma, with the sister of Imam Reza, or the eighth Imam in the Shia lineage. And so there's a lot of Shia pilgrims who attend this shrine and recite the Quran and do their prayers and supplications there. And not many people know this. You know, they tend to think that the religious establishment there is all male and patriarchal, right. But the spiritual dimension of that cannot be sort of separated from female Sufis and saints.
Absolutely. And this is what I love about saint veneration within all religious traditions. It is especially offers women an opportunity to be out of the home. You know, there's the Esther Mordechai tomb in Hamadan in Iran, and Jewish women would go there, spend the night, and just pray and ask Esther Mordechai to intercede on their behalf. And so it really allows women this opportunity, what we refer to as a domestication of religion, to really, in terms of the traditional religion, which tells women, you know, you're not going to the mosques, you're not really going to the synagogues. And if you are, at least within the Persian tradition, women were in the upstairs, in the back, segregated, gossiping, and really trying to find spouses for their children and grandchildren. The saint veneration, especially of female saints, was really a wonderful way for women to be able to participate in the religion and create a sacred space for themselves outside of the male space.
Mm-hmm. Professor Sumer, you have a question from Maufur. He's a professor at one of the Islamic universities in Kadiri. So he was asking, could you please explain the position of women according to Jewish theology and how that has affected women's freedom in Israel?
It's a great question, and it's such a dense question. And the idea within traditional Judaism, because you have different levels of Judaism in North America, the most liberal being Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative. Then you have modern Orthodox, Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox. But traditionally, women were seen as, you know, separate but equal. They had different mitzvot, different commandments that they had to follow. And if the commandments within the Jewish tradition required that a woman leaves the house and, you know, if it required her to not be able to take care of the house, the children, etc., she didn't have to comply by those, such as going to the synagogue. She could stay at home and prepare the Sabbath meal, etc. So it doesn't mean, it's very similar to Islam in the context that it doesn't mean she's any less significant. It just means that the way she shows her piety is just different. And it's always traditionally been around the domestic sphere. And just as male leaders within the Islamic tradition are incredibly important and their wives were important, so were the Rebbitzin, the wives of the great rabbis. However, women weren't traditionally allowed to go to study Torah. It was considered too dangerous for them, too overwhelming. They would, you know, the fear was that they were going to lead their families. So they weren't allowed to study Talmud, rabbinic commentaries. They weren't traditionally allowed to be rabbis. And again, just very similar to Islam, traditional Islam, a woman's voice was considered too sexual. So she wasn't allowed to read or sing from the Torah in public. Different levels of Judaism have appropriated and modernized. So I personally am a part of the conservative movement. I have female rabbis, female cantors who sing from the Torah. Girls have their bat mitzvah. Men and women are absolutely equal in the synagogues that I attend. Men and women sit next to each other, etc. Israel, though, practices traditional Judaism. The Reform conservative movements, while they exist there, they don't have leadership. They don't have power the way the religious movements do. And basically the way the government was set up in 48 and with the prime minister was, you know, but David Ben-Gurion said, give us what we want, women join the army, etc. We will let you guys, meaning the religious establishment, you will deal with women in the private sphere. Again, as we've talked about, marriage, divorce, etc. And this is where we do, and I will say this as someone who is a Jewish feminist, this is where the laws are misogynistic. As we talked about, you know, women chose jumping in there and trying to help them get a divorce, suing parents of the man who will not let the woman get a divorce, etc. So what we're seeing is that in some ways, Israel, in many ways, is very liberal and very proactive in its equality for women. And then in other ways, it still has a ways to go. but there are people who are fighting for it and fighting on behalf of it. And the beauty of the country is if you fight on that behalf, you're not being imprisoned. Women are not being imprisoned because they're trying to help other women with, rules, laws, etc.
So I'd like to extend that discussion and ask you whether, there is such stipulation in any of the conservative Jewish theological interpretations of its teaching on the wali system or the male guardianship system. Is there such thing in Jewish doctrines or teachings?
I don't know. I'm so sorry. I can't answer that. I know that, for example, if there were arranged marriages, the woman would be able to see her husband before, give the approval. She was not allowed, they were not allowed to be sexually active until she started menstruating, etc. But traditionally, I don't think that there was that male guardianship. I mean, traditionally, maybe long time ago, but you're not seeing that today. You might see it with the ultra-Orthodox community, though.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hasidic community or the Haredi community.
In one of the very famous verses of the Quran in our scripture, it says, "Ar-rijalu qawwumun 'ala an-nisa," basically, essentially meaning, in the most sort of direct translation, is that men are leaders over women. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on that, or whether there are any sort of nuanced interpretations on this verse, because obviously some scholars and theologians would argue, the more progressive ones would argue that the concept of ar-rijal there does not necessarily point to males, but rather to masculine characteristics in a person. And so obviously that shifts the discussion from being male leaders to people who have more masculine features and characteristics in their personality, who should govern over women. So what's your sort of liberal interpretation, if you like?
Some people might call me an apologist for religious traditions, but I do want to believe that they're not patriarchal inherently, and that the leaders did see them in separate but equal ways. And so we have similar concepts in Judaism. And if you want to see it from a secular perspective, as someone from the outside, you'll look at this and say it's patriarchal. But if you're someone from the belief system, as a practicing Muslim woman, as a practicing Jewish woman, you want to understand it in a different understanding and in a way that brings it into the 21st century. And so I think the beauty of semantics, is especially Arabic and Hebrew, is that you could begin to take a word and take it apart in order to truly understand it in a different context. Look, and Dickie, you know this, everyone knows this who's on this, religion could be used in such positive ways, and the same text could be used in negative ways. In America, religion was used to justify slavery, and at the same time it was used to absolve slavery, the New Testament, the Bible, etc. So I think the beauty is that you could use it and utilize it in ways to see it in a more liberal understanding. And as we've seen, people have politicized it, especially in countries where they are taking it in order to justify misogyny against women.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask any of the members of the audience or the participants. Yes, we have a question from Professor Michael Northcott. He's originally from England, but is a professor emeritus from Edinburgh University, but who is now affiliated with ICRS.
Hi, Professor Northcott.
Hello, thank you very much. And lovely to hear your Californian accent. I'm living in Bali, where there's also quite a lot of Californians who've escaped the current state of the United States, and I don't blame them at all. I've escaped the current state of Europe. Coming from Britain as I do, I'm well aware of the influence of Britain, but also America, on the three countries you've just been talking about. But I've noticed you didn't discuss that. I mean, I'm quite a political animal, and I get more political the older I get, particularly when I'm subjected to the degree of medical fascism that has been imposed on the West in the last few months. So if you look at it, Israel obviously was established by the British Mandate, and the House of Saud had absolutely no traditional claim to be the guardians of the Holy Land, but was established by the British Empire as the guardian, essentially, not only of the sites, but of course of the oil wells, which is why they were appointed.
Right.
And the United States took up that role, of course, from the British after the Second World War, and half of the money that should have been paid by the US to Saudi Arabia for the oil that they used to huge quantities from never actually left the US. It was used by American companies to build infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. So the whole political economy, universities, hospitals, was all built with American money and using American tech instead of giving them cash, dollars. And then, of course, you have Iran.
Right.
Iran was also essentially a British mandate. It was all British oil wells. It was called we used to have this thing called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which then changed its name to BP. When Mossadegh, the legally and democratically elected president of that country, declared that he'd like more than 5% of the value of Iranian oil to remain in Iran, not unreasonably. I think it's 5% or 10%. It was something ludicrously small anyway, not unreasonably. Winston Churchill then called, who was the president then? I've forgotten. But whoever it was.
Yeah, Operation Ajax.
Yeah, he called him up and he says on the phone, he says, you got to do something about Mossadegh. We're going to lose all our money. And that's what's paying our war debt to the Americans. Not many people know that we only paid off our debt to the Americans for fighting the Second World War under Gordon Brown when he sold our gold in about 2006. So that led, of course, to the Shah, which was a very secular liberal period. And for women, actually, it was a period of relative liberation compared to many other Muslim countries. And then, of course, the huge and extreme reaction. So in all three cases, you have essentially revolutionary ideologies promoted by the extremes of British colonialism, then taken over by the Americans in all three cases. So, I mean, I'm looking at what's the theory here? I mean, to me, it's not enough to speak about religious studies and feminism. You have to see the connection between the kinds of, I think, quite perverse understandings of women that have emerged in Wahhabism, and it's spread across the world with petrodollars, including to here in Indonesia, and colonialism. Wahhabism is a reactionary and revolutionary creed. It's more Bolsheviks than it is traditional, as is, of course, US fundamentalism, or more recently, from my perspective, the gender identity ideology, which also emerged from, guess where, the United States. So when you look at this whole mix, I think it's very hard, it's very hard for me anyway to look at it without looking at the roles of the British Empire and then the way the American took over that role. And of course, the whole kind of Bolshevik French revolutionary tradition, which is that you totally remake tradition when faced with modernity. Mm-hmm. You don't find a way to keep tradition going. And that's actually what's happened. I mean, here in Indonesia, I lived in Malaysia in the 80s, so I knew this culture quite well. And you had matriarchy in some states in Malaysia. You have matriarchy in parts of Sumatra. And you had women able to dress the same as men, simply wearing a sarong. They didn't have to cover themselves. It was, as a result, quite normal for women to have quite significant roles. In fact, in many ways, Malaysia was still quite advanced, and I think Indonesia less so, but in many spheres also advanced compared to other parts of the Muslim world, and especially the Middle East, in a way that it gives very prominent roles to women. But this doesn't reflect Wahhabism or Salafism. It reflects an earlier, I would argue, tradition, which is that Islam here in Southeast Asia developed as very much an indigenous culture, where there was a matriarchy before, as in Batak culture, as in Sumatra, as in Negeri Sembilan in Malaysia. That matriarchy was simply taken over into Islam. So what you have, in a way, is a kind of petrodollar-fueled neo-colonial Salafism, which is reshaping, I think in some toxic ways, but I'm an outsider and others might want to comment, gender relations here in Indonesia and Malaysia. And Well, it's not so much a question as a comment, really, but it just seems to me that we can't confine our discussion of these matters to religious studies and feminism. We have to see the broader picture. And only then can we understand, how have these incredible swings, for example, in Iran, in the status of women, backwards and forwards. And as Dickie says, of course, women never accepted what was being done to them. Most of them were horrified. Particularly the middle class women. My wife's is married to an Iranian sister, I should say. So we know Iran quite well, and we know Iranian customs, and we know that many Iranians just got out rather than submit.
Right. I live in Los Angeles.
It was a reaction to a reaction. That's what I'm trying to say, really.
Right.
And I guess so I don't know whether you have any comment on all of that, but it's rather a lot, I realize. But it's just, it was a very interesting lecture, and I love the comparison between these three countries. But I couldn't help feeling, as a British, that there was a missing dimension in this lecture about these three countries and the damage Britain did to all three of them over hundreds of years.
You're absolutely right. And if I had a semester to really focus on all of that, I had 45 minutes, so I couldn't really get into
It's not a criticism.
Right.
No, you're right. To say something now.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, because you can't look at these countries. Most of it is a reaction to a reaction. You had the Pahlavi regime, for example, in Iran, a country that I know well. You reacted to the Qajar dynasty and Shia rule since the Safavi dynasty, and they were heavily inspired not only by Ataturk and Turkey and the secularization post World War I, but also mostly by Europe. They were very, they wanted to look like France. And one of the biggest critiques of Mohammed Reza Pahlavi and his wife Farah was they didn't care about Persians. They really wanted to be the king and queen of a European country. And we saw this when they had their big party in Persepolis, that by conservative standards was a couple of $1 million in the early 1970s. But for the most part, it was something like $20 million. And who did they invite? All Europeans and Americans, as they basically celebrated the 2,500-year rule of the Achaemenid Empire. And so you had the Qajar dynasty, then the forced secularization of Iranians, Persians, changing their name to Iran to even invoke the Aryan spirit of who they are. And then, of course, the pendulum swings so far to the right again after that with, the Khomeini coming in and the theocracy and stuff. And all of this politicization, all of it is taking place on a woman's body. Yeah.
And so the woman almost becomes a site for all these forces to be played out.
Absolutely. And this is what I always, and again, when I teach a course like this over a semester, we look at the politics, and we always look at the number one thing that is always being affected are women. Their bodies, their rights, their rituals, their practices, their control over themselves, their control over their children. All of this is always played out on women and their agency. Absolutely.
But I do find it very shocking. And then when I see what I can only call globalist organizations now promoting transgender and ideology and gender identity ideology, where the idea is that one's gender and how one was born, one's chromosomes are not the same anymore. And this is, again, coming from the US, and I would argue it's quite an extreme ideology. And I'm an environmentalist, and I believe that the biological order carries meaning, which most religions pick up in different ways. And this is the fruit of an extreme secularization when you say that gender and biology are just completely disconnected. So, of course, you then get a reaction to that as well in Muslim countries. But I can sort of understand that, because to me, it's another extremist revolutionary ideology churned out by globalist organizations, which are still essentially colonialist in their attitudes to developing countries. We're going to go in there and we're going to give them schools or give them hospitals. We're going to, change their agriculture, change their gender relations. We've not learned. The West has not learned from all this.
Right.
Right,
and that's one of my biggest criticism that Sorry, Dickie, go ahead.
Well, by extension, I'd also like to ask, you mentioned how, Israeli women are so far, ahead in terms of, gender equality and the role in society and politics and so on. And I was just wondering what the popular imagination and popular perception of Israelis are toward the Arab Muslim women, within Israel and outside of Israel. I mean, are there any studies that look at these popular imaginations and perceptions toward
It's a great question, Dickie. And unfortunately, when I was focusing on Israel, it was just mostly on Jewish women because I didn't have the time to get into then Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians. I don't want to say Arab because there's Arab Jews too. So Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians, but it's not the same. They don't have the same. I mean, they don't have. A lot of them, for example, in Ramallah and definitely in Gaza are in schools, et cetera. The literacy rate is high, but of course, they're bound by more traditional aspects because, again, the Muslim courts are the ones who are dealing with family, et cetera. And so their rights are not the same as they are for Jewish secular Israelis. And again, I should say more secular. We're not looking at the Haredi community or the ultra-Orthodox. We're looking at, most of Israel, the Jewish community is secular. So it's definitely not the same in terms of the rights that they have or the job opportunities that they have, not only because of family, not only because of tradition, but also because, as Israel, they're just like every nation. There's, even though they are equal, there's still, a lot of racism towards them within Israel proper and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps the last question, which you might want to.
But can I just, Dickie, really quickly? I was in the West Bank. I was in Ramallah, and I was getting a tour of a really cool tech place, and it was completely filled with women. Filled with women wearing the hijab, filled with women who were not wearing the hijab. Most of the people in the tech industry at that site, which was like one of the #1 tech place centers in Ramallah, were women. So it's Ramallah, especially because of what's, it's a bit more secular, et cetera. You really do see women in the universities, out in the public sphere, and the job forces, et cetera. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just, I wanted your views and perception, or if you have any observations, pertaining to the COVID-19 pandemic and the, subsequent physical, social distancing and social restrictions. Is there any sort of gender lens or perspective that we can use, both perhaps in Los Angeles or in any of these 3 countries? And are we seeing sort of an increased level of discrimination against women during this COVID-19 pandemic? We have seen a sort of a spike in domestic abuse in Indonesia and
yes.
A lot of
all over the world.
Yes, and what is your observation on this and your reflection?
There's no doubt that COVID has been so difficult for everyone, but there is no doubt that women are bearing the brunt of it. #1, the domestic abuse, it has gone up, as we've talked about, in Israel. It's gone up in Iran. It's gone up in every country in the world, where women are literally feeling helpless. And then 2, the burden placed on women as mothers, as workers, as now homeschool teachers. You're definitely seeing this intense sense of women feeling not only trapped, but just this burden. How are they supposed to do all of it? Be on Zoom all day working, if not working, if you're middle class, lower middle, coming from a different socioeconomic bracket, at least in America, you are like a first responder. You are going to the grocery store, you're working. You don't have the luxury of staying at home. And who's taking care of children now? That the schools, the daycare centers, et cetera. So there's no doubt that that COVID has affected the whole world. But we are seeing mostly that women and the impact it has had on women within domestic physical abuse, and also just the pressure placed on them to really keep the family together while being, homeschool teachers. It's something that they were not trained to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll make the last call for any questions or comments that you may have for Professor Sumer before we close the session. It's been a really wonderful conversation with you. And I think we sort of plan to have you here last year or sometime this year, but unfortunately, we have yet to be able to do so. Anyways, we have this question from Harry Crisp, and she is a student in CRCS, our master's program. And I'll just read out her question. It's in the chat. We've seen with some of the pro-democracy movements recently across East Asia and Southeast Asia, there's a lot of working together and sharing of techniques and ideas. For example, through social media between Hong Kong and Thai activists. Do you see something similar happening with the women's movements across the Middle East? Are there regional movements, or are movements primarily centered on individual nations?
It's a great question. You know, when under the Obama administration, when there was so much fear about Iran and a nuclearizing, which there is still that fear. You did have Iranians and you did have Israelis with signs saying Israel loves Iran, Iran loves Israel, again, saying that we're beyond these political issues and the nuclear issues. Now with the Abraham Accords, basically Israel signing a peace treaty with Bahrain, UAE, et cetera, you're seeing the women really connecting with each other, working with each other. You know, we saw this a lot under the Pahlavi regime, where the Shah was very impressed with Israel. And this is, again, one of the reasons that led to his downfall. So we had nurses come from Hadassah Hospital, come to Tehran, Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, to teach nurses in Tehran. You know, you did see a lot of that interaction taking place. I only hope that there will be more. I know that, and you probably know this better than I do, Dickie, with environmental aspects of it, desalinization, et cetera, you're seeing a lot of the countries working together where they normally won't, because they know that there's an environmental crisis of global warming, water, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so with that, I'd like to ask everyone to give a round of applause, a virtual round of applause, to Professor Saba Sumer for her fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun to be here. I wish I was there, but this is the next best thing.
But inshallah, we will invite you, and hopefully the pandemic will be over, and we will have you teach in ICRS and perhaps also in the Islamic and also the Christian universities. So thank you very much. Kheli, mamnoon.
Thank you so much, everyone. خواهش میکنم. مرسی.
خداحافظ.
خداحافظ. Bye, everyone.